She was 19 years old and had nowhere left to sleep when the wagon finally set her down at the edge of Millbrook Crossing, Kansas, with a single trunk, a shawl her mother had left her, and $6 folded inside her glove. It was her own stepfather, Garrett Lund, who had put her out of the only home she had ever known, the day after her mother's funeral, telling the neighbors plainly that a grown stepdaughter with no blood claim on his land was a mouth he no longer intended to feed. With her $6 and little else, she bought the one thing in that town no one else wanted: a deserted ranch house sitting empty for 9 years out past Cutter's Creek, its windows boarded, its fields gone to seed, sold to her for almost nothing because the county simply wished to be rid of it. Every soul who watched her sign that paper called it a fool's bargain, a house too haunted by its own history to ever be lived in again. None of them knew that behind a wall in that house's oldest room lay something sealed away for nearly a decade. Something that would not only give her back everything she had lost, but would return to Millbrook Crossing a debt it did not even know it was owed. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Mercer. If you have ever been told that a broken, forgotten place wasn't worth saving, we would love to hear about it in the comments. And if stories about people finding worth where others found none speak to you the way they speak to us, we'd be glad to have you stay with us longer. Follow or subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss where a story like Eleanor's leads next. Eleanor Mercer had come into the world in the spring of 1868, in a modest farmhouse some 3 miles outside Millbrook Crossing, Kansas, a town that had grown up along a bend in the Solomon River, trading in wheat, cattle, and the particular stubbornness required to farm land that gave up its bounty only grudgingly, and only to those who understood its moods. Her father, Daniel Mercer, had been a carpenter and cabinet maker of some skill, a man known across 3 counties for the honesty of his joinery and the quiet care he put into work that most men would have rushed. And it was from him, in the years before consumption took him, when Eleanor was only 11, that she learned the trade that would shape the rest of her life. She spent her childhood not with dolls or needlework, but at her father's workbench, learning to read the grain of a plank the way some children learn to read letters. Learning that a good joint was invisible because it fit so perfectly it needed no nail or peg to hold. Learning above all that patient, careful work outlasted anything built in haste. Because wood, like people, remembered how it had been treated. Daniel Mercer had built half the fine cabinetry and staircases in Millbrook Crossing before his illness took him, including, Eleanor would later learn with a shiver of recognition, several built-in cupboards and paneled walls in the grandest ranch house the county had ever seen. A sprawling place built in the early 1870s by a cattleman named Thaddeus Rourke, who had made his fortune driving longhorns up from Texas along the western trails, and had wanted, upon settling permanently in Kansas, a home that reflected the scale of his ambitions. Eleanor's father had spoken of that commission more than once at his workbench, telling his young daughter, with a craftsman's private pride, that Rourke had asked him to build certain features into the house that no other soul but the 2 of them would ever fully understand. Cabinetry designed not merely for beauty, but for concealment, a common enough request, her father explained, from wealthy men who did not entirely trust banks with everything they owned. Eleanor had been perhaps 9 years old when she heard this, and she had not thought of it again for a very long time, filing it away the way children file away the strange, half-understood conversations of adults, without knowing that it would matter to her life at all. Her mother, Ruth Mercer, was left a young widow with a daughter to raise, and a small farm too modest to support them both without help. And it was 3 years after Daniel's death, when Eleanor was 14, that Ruth married Garrett Lund, a widower himself with land adjoining their own and 2 grown sons from his first marriage, who had long since moved on to their own holdings elsewhere. Eleanor never warmed to her stepfather in the way her mother perhaps hoped she might, sensing early on a coldness in him that only ever softened when Ruth herself was present to see it. But she kept her own counsel and worked hard at whatever tasks the household required, continuing in whatever quiet hours she could steal to practice the woodworking her father had taught her. Using his old tools, which Ruth had carefully preserved, to mend furniture and build small, useful things for the household that Garrett accepted without much comment, as though her skill were simply a convenient tool rather than an inheritance worth acknowledging. Ruth Mercer Lund's health began to fail in the winter of 1886. A slow-wasting sickness the local doctor could not name with any confidence, and Eleanor nursed her mother faithfully through nearly 18 months of decline, learning in that long, difficult season a different kind of patience than the one her father had taught her at the workbench. The patience required to sit quietly with someone you loved while they slipped further from you with each passing week, offering what comfort could be offered and asking nothing in return. Ruth died in the early spring of 1887, and Eleanor, not yet 19, buried her beside Daniel Mercer in the small cemetery outside town, believing, in her grief, that whatever difficulties lay ahead, she would at least face them from the only home she had ever known. Garrett Lund disabused her of that belief within a day of the funeral. He informed her, standing in the kitchen where Eleanor had spent countless hours at her mother's side during that final illness, that the farm and house had always been legally his own, deeded to him alone at the time of his marriage to Ruth, and that Eleanor, having no blood tie to him and no legal claim on property that had never belonged to her mother outright, would need to make her own arrangements going forward. He was not cruel in his delivery, only cold, the same practical coldness Eleanor had always sensed beneath his politer moments, and he offered her, as though it were generosity, a week's time to gather her belongings and a small sum of money, $6 in total, which he called a fair settlement of whatever claim sentiment might suggest she had on a household that legally owed her nothing at all. Eleanor left with her father's toolbox, her mother's good shawl, a single trunk of clothing and keepsakes, and those $6, walking the 3 miles into Millbrook Crossing itself, because she had nowhere else in the world to walk to. She spent 2 nights at the boarding house run by a kindly widow named Mrs. Alma Pruitt, who took pity on the girl's obvious grief and charged her less than the going rate, and she spent those 2 nights turning over every possibility she could imagine for a woman alone with $6 and no family willing to claim her. She could take in sewing, though her stitches had never matched her woodworking for skill. She could seek work as a hired girl on some neighboring farm, trading her labor for room and board and precious little else. Or she could do something considerably more foolish, which was to ask, at the county land office the following morning, exactly what property in the area might be available for a price low enough that $6 could actually secure it. The clerk at the land office, a patient older man named Mr. Holloway, who had known Daniel Mercer slightly in years past, told her there was exactly one such property on the county's books, and he told her with the particular reluctance of a man delivering news he suspected would only disappoint. The old Rourke Ranch house, standing empty and untended for 9 years out past Cutter's Creek, had been sitting on the county's rolls since its last owner defaulted on taxes years before, and the county, weary of maintaining a claim on a property no one wanted, was prepared to sell it outright for a nominal sum simply to be free of the obligation. $6, as it happened, was more than sufficient. Mr. Holloway warned her plainly that the house had stood empty since Thaddeus Rourke himself had vanished from the county under circumstances no one in Millbrook Crossing had ever fully explained, sometime in the year 1878, leaving debts unpaid his cattle unattended, and his grand house locked up exactly as he had left it. And that in the years since. The place had gathered around itself the particular unease that abandoned grand houses always seem to gather, until most folks in town simply avoided the road out past Cutter's Creek rather than pass too close to it after dark. Eleanor thought of her father's workbench and his half-remembered mention of the cabinetry he had built into that very house, features designed for concealment that only he and Rourke had ever fully understood, and something in her, some quiet certainty she could not entirely explain even to herself, told her that the house was not cursed at all, only waiting. She signed the papers that afternoon, becoming, for $6, the legal owner of the largest and most thoroughly abandoned house in the county. And when she mentioned her purchase to Mrs. Pruitt that evening, the older woman's face went pale with genuine concern, and she urged Eleanor, gently but firmly, to reconsider, saying that whatever had driven Thaddeus Rourke from his own home so suddenly and completely had never sat right with the town, and that a young woman alone had no business sleeping under that particular roof. But Eleanor Mercer had $6 and nowhere else to spend it, and the following morning she walked the 4 miles out to Cutter's Creek with her father's toolbox in one hand and her trunk dragged behind her on a borrowed handcart, and stood for a long moment at the edge of the overgrown drive, looking up at the house her own father's hands had helped to finish some 16 years before. The Rourke Ranch house, even in its neglect, was clearly built to impress, a 2-story structure of good lumber and fine proportions, with a wide porch running the length of its front and tall windows now boarded against 9 years of prairie weather. And Eleanor felt, walking up that overgrown path, something closer to homecoming than trespass, as though the house itself recognized the daughter of the man who had shaped its finest details. It took her the better part of a week to make even a few rooms habitable, prying boards from windows to let in light, sweeping years of dust and the leavings of mice and birds from the floors, and testing, board by board, which parts of the structure remained sound and which had begun to give way to rot and time. She slept, that first week, on a pallet in the kitchen, the room that seemed sturdiest and easiest to keep warm, and worked her way slowly through the rest of the house as her strength and the daylight allowed. It was in the 3rd week, working her way through what had clearly once been Thaddeus Rourke's own study, a handsome room paneled in dark walnut along its northern wall, that Eleanor's trained eye caught something the average person would have walked past 100 times without noticing. Her father's particular skill, the one he had passed to her at his workbench, was an instinct for how joinery ought to look when it was purely structural, versus when it had been built with some other purpose in mind. And something about the paneling on that northern wall struck her immediately as wrong. It seemed too regular. Its grain matched with a care that served no purpose she could see in a simple study wall. She ran her fingers along the paneling the way her father had taught her to read wood, feeling for the places where true joints gave way to something else, and found, low along the baseboard, a small brass fitting disguised cleverly as an ordinary furniture nail, which, when pressed and turned exactly as such fittings were designed to be operated, released an entire section of the paneled wall on a concealed hinge, swinging inward to reveal a narrow room no larger than a closet, built into the space between the study and the room beyond it. Exactly the kind of hidden concealment her father had once hinted, all those years ago at his workbench, that Thaddeus Rourke had specifically requested. The hidden room, when Eleanor finally stepped inside with a lit lamp held before her, proved to be dry, sound, and undisturbed by 9 years of neglect, its contents exactly as they had been left the day Thaddeus Rourke vanished from Millbrook Crossing. A modest iron strongbox sat against the far wall, unlocked, its contents already taken, which told Eleanor immediately that whatever had happened to Rourke, someone, likely Rourke himself, had returned to this room before finally leaving the county for good and removed whatever coin or valuables it had once held. But beside the empty strongbox, on a small shelf built into the wall, sat a leather-bound ledger and a stack of personal letters tied with cord, along with a single framed photograph of a young woman Eleanor did not recognize. And it was these papers, rather than any vanished treasure, that would prove to hold the true weight of what Thaddeus Rourke had left behind. The ledger, when Eleanor sat down that evening to read it by lamplight, told a story considerably more complicated than the simple tale of a vanished cattle baron that Millbrook Crossing had told itself for 9 years. Thaddeus Rourke, it emerged, had not built his fortune driving longhorns alone, but had done so in partnership with a syndicate of investors from Kansas City, men who had put up considerable capital to finance his cattle operations in exchange for a share of the profits, an arrangement common enough in that era of expanding Western ranching. The ledger recorded, in careful and increasingly troubled entries across 1877 and into 1878, Rourke's growing conviction that his primary partner in that syndicate, a Kansas City banker named Josiah Thorne, had been systematically falsifying the herd counts and profit reports sent to the other, smaller investors, skimming a share for himself that the ledger's figures, when set against Rourke's own careful tallies of actual cattle driven and actual sale proceeds received, could not otherwise explain. Rourke's entries grew steadily more anxious through the early months of 1878, describing correspondence with Thorne in which Rourke pressed for an accounting of the discrepancies, and describing, in one particularly striking entry, a visit from 2 men Rourke did not name directly, but described only as Thorne's associates, who had come to Millbrook Crossing not to discuss business openly, but to deliver, in carefully polite language, the clear suggestion that Rourke would do well to let the matter of the discrepancies rest quietly, for the sake of his own continued prosperity and safety. The final entries in the ledger, dated in the late summer of 1878, described Rourke's decision to gather every document proving Thorne's fraud, including sworn statements he had quietly obtained from 2 former syndicate clerks willing to testify to the falsified figures, and to travel to Topeka himself to lay the matter before the Territorial Banking Commission, rather than risk bringing further danger onto his own household by continuing to fight the matter from Millbrook Crossing. The letters bundled alongside the ledger, addressed to a woman named Cassandra Whitfield, whose photograph sat framed on the shelf, revealed the rest of what the town had never known. Rourke had been engaged to be married, quietly and not yet publicly announced, to a young schoolteacher from a neighboring county, and his final letter to her, dated the very week he vanished, explained that he intended to travel first to Topeka to settle the matter of Thorne's fraud through proper legal channels, and only afterward to return to Millbrook Crossing to claim her hand and make their engagement known, once he could be certain the danger surrounding the matter had passed. He had hidden the strongbox's coin and the incriminating ledger documents in the very concealment her own father had built for him, intending to retrieve them again once his business in Topeka was concluded. And he had, evidently, returned at least once more to remove the coin, perhaps to fund his journey or to protect it from whatever danger he feared. But he had never returned again after that to reclaim the ledger and letters he had left behind, and no record existed in all the county of Thaddeus Rourke ever having been seen again, in Topeka or anywhere else, after the late summer of 1878. Eleanor sat with those papers for a long while that night, feeling the particular grief of learning a man's fate through the very last words he had ever written, understanding that Thaddeus Rourke had very likely never reached Topeka at all, or had reached it and met some quiet, unrecorded misfortune at the hands of men determined that his evidence against Josiah Thorne never see daylight. She understood, too, with a slow and sobering dawning, that Josiah Thorne, if the ledger's dates and figures were accurate, was very likely still a man of standing in Kansas City even now, 9 years later, his fraud never exposed. His fortune built in part on money skimmed from smaller investors who had trusted him. And very possibly, she began to suspect as she read the sworn clerk's statements more carefully, from certain smaller local backers in Millbrook Crossing itself, men and families in her own town who had put modest savings into Rourke's cattle operation, believing themselves partners in an honest venture, and who had simply been told, once Rourke vanished, that the operation had collapsed along with him, its debts and losses never fully explained. It took Eleanor the better part of 2 weeks, and several careful conversations with Mr. Holloway at the land office and old Mrs. Pruitt at the boarding house, to piece together exactly who those smaller local investors had been. She learned that no fewer than 6 Millbrook Crossing families, including the parents of the current town blacksmith and the aging widow who ran the dry goods store, had each put small but meaningful savings into Rourke's cattle syndicate in the years before his disappearance, sums ranging from $50 to several $100s each. Money that represented, for most of them, the difference between comfortable security and the precarious scraping by that had defined their lives ever since. When Rourke vanished and the operation folded, Thorne's syndicate, operating out of Kansas City, had simply declared the venture a total loss due to Rourke's disappearance and mismanagement, a story the ledger and clerk statements now proved to be a deliberate lie covering Thorne's own fraud, and had never returned a single dollar to any of the local families who had trusted their modest fortunes to it. Eleanor understood, holding those old papers in the paneled study her own father had built, that she now possessed something considerably more valuable than any coin that might once have sat in Rourke's strongbox. She possessed proof, sworn and documented, that could very possibly force Josiah Thorne, if he could still be found, and if the Territorial Banking Commission could still be persuaded to examine evidence 9 years old, to make restitution to families who had waited nearly a decade believing their losses simply the price of bad luck, rather than deliberate theft. She did not act immediately, understanding that a woman of 19, alone, with no standing and no proof beyond old papers found in a hidden room, would need considerable care to be taken seriously by any authority capable of acting on what she had found. She spent the following months restoring the ranch house as best her limited means allowed, taking in the modest carpentry commissions that her father's old reputation and her own growing skill began, slowly, to attract from a town that had initially regarded her purchase as an act of pure foolishness, and using those small earnings to travel, whenever she could afford the fare, to Topeka, where she sought out the Territorial Banking Commission's offices and asked, patiently and repeatedly, what had become of any complaint filed against Josiah Thorne's Kansas City syndicate back in 1878. It was on her third such visit, in the spring of 1888, that a young clerk newly assigned to the Commission's records, sympathetic to her persistence where his superiors had been dismissive, helped her locate an old, unresolved file confirming that a complaint had indeed once been logged against Thorne's operation, filed not by Rourke himself, who had apparently never arrived to file it in person, but by a Topeka attorney who noted in his own hand that his client had failed to appear for a scheduled meeting and had not been heard from since, a note that had simply been filed away and forgotten in the press of more urgent commission business. With that file, and with Rourke's own ledger and the sworn clerk's statements, now finally corroborated by an official record confirming the original complaint had genuinely existed, Eleanor at last had something a commission investigator could not easily dismiss. It was around this same time that word of Eleanor's persistent inquiries reached, through channels she never fully traced, Josiah Thorne himself, now a respected and considerably wealthy figure in Kansas City banking circles, and it was Thorne who sent, that summer, a well-dressed representative to Millbrook Crossing, with an offer meant to end the matter quietly. The representative, a smooth-spoken man named Mr. Ellery Cobb, found Eleanor at the ranch house and offered her, on Thorne's behalf, a private sum of $200 in exchange for the ledger, the letters, and her silence regarding whatever old business she believed she had uncovered, framing it generously as compensation for her trouble in restoring what he called a worthless old ruin. Eleanor, who understood exactly what such an offer represented, told Mr. Cobb plainly that the matter no longer belonged to her alone to settle, since 6 families in her own town had waited 9 years for money that was rightfully theirs, and that she intended to see the Commission's investigation through properly. Whatever inconvenience that caused Mr. Thorne, Cobb's tone shifted considerably once his generous offer was refused, and in the weeks that followed, Eleanor found herself facing the particular pressure that a wealthy, threatened man could bring to bear even from a distance. A local bank, with whom she had recently opened a small account from her carpentry earnings, suddenly discovered irregularities requiring her account be closed pending review. A shipment of good lumber she had ordered for repairs to the ranch house's roof was mysteriously delayed for months beyond any reasonable explanation. And twice, in the autumn of that year, she received anonymous letters warning her, in language carefully vague enough to avoid any provable threat, that persistent women sometimes came to unfortunate ends in a territory still rough enough to swallow such misfortunes without much notice. Eleanor did not frighten easily, having already survived her mother's long illness, her stepfather's cold dismissal, and 9 years of a house's abandoned silence, and she responded to the pressure the same way her father had always responded to difficult wood, by working the problem patiently rather than forcing it. She gathered the 6 families whose money had been lost in Thorne's fraud and showed them, in the privacy of the ranch house's restored study, the ledger and letters that proved their losses had been deliberate theft rather than misfortune, and she asked each of them to put their own recollections and any surviving old correspondence from the syndicate years into sworn statements of their own, building, family by family, a case too broad and too well corroborated for any single threat or bribe to quietly bury. She wrote again to the sympathetic young clerk in Topeka, sending him copies of everything she had gathered, and it was his quiet persistence within the Commission's own offices, more than any dramatic confrontation, that finally moved a senior investigator named Commissioner Aldrich to formally reopen the 1878 complaint and summon Josiah Thorne to answer for it directly. The hearing, held in Topeka in the spring of 1889, drew considerably more attention than Thorne had evidently expected. Once local Millbrook Crossing families arrived with their own sworn testimony to add to Rourke's ledger and the clerk's statements Eleanor had preserved for nearly 2 years. Thorne's own lawyers argued, as such lawyers always do, that the evidence was old, the original complainant long vanished and unavailable to testify, and the whole matter too stale to properly adjudicate. But Commissioner Aldrich, examining the careful precision of Rourke's own figures against Thorne's syndicate records, which Thorne was legally compelled to finally produce in full, found the discrepancies too plain and too consistent across nearly a decade to dismiss as coincidence or confusion. The Commission's formal finding, delivered that summer, confirmed that Josiah Thorne had indeed falsified profit reports across the full span of the Rourke Cattle Syndicate's operation, and ordered restitution, with accumulated interest, to be paid to every documented investor whose losses could be verified. Restitution that ultimately returned to the 6 Millbrook Crossing families a sum considerably larger than what they had originally lost, enough to clear old debts, repair aging homes, and in the blacksmith's case, finally expand a modest shop that had struggled for years under the weight of a loss he had never understood the true cause of. Josiah Thorne's standing in Kansas City banking circles did not survive the public finding intact. And within 2 years, his own investors, having learned exactly what kind of man they had trusted their capital to, had largely withdrawn their confidence and their funds, leaving him to spend his remaining years in a diminished, quieter fashion considerably removed from the prominence he had once enjoyed. A justice that arrived not through violence or vengeance, but through the same patient accumulation of plain, undeniable truth that Eleanor's father had once taught her to trust in a piece of well-joined wood. Thaddeus Rourke's fate was never fully resolved, though Commissioner Aldrich's investigation did eventually turn up a record, long buried in a Topeka coroner's old files, of an unidentified man's body recovered from the river outside the city in the autumn of 1878. A record that Cassandra Whitfield traced at last to a teaching post in a neighboring county, and informed gently of everything Eleanor had discovered. Received with the particular grief of a woman finally allowed, after 9 long years of uncertainty, to properly mourn what she had always quietly feared. Eleanor gave her, when they finally met, Rourke's last letter, believing it belonged more rightly to the woman he had written it for than to the house that had merely kept it safe. And so we return, at last, to where this story began, to a girl of 19 standing at the edge of an overgrown drive with $6 and a trunk, buying a deserted ranch house that an entire town believed too cursed to ever be lived in again. Eleanor Mercer never regretted that purchase, not through all the difficulty that followed, because what she found waiting behind that paneled wall was never merely old coin or old grief, but a debt 9 years overdue, owed to families who had simply been told to accept their losses as misfortune rather than theft. She restored that house with the same patience her father had taught her at his workbench, learning that some things, whether wood or truth, reveal their real nature only to those willing to look closely enough and wait long enough to see it plainly. And in restoring it, she gave back to Millbrook Crossing something far more valuable than any treasure, which was simply the truth of what had actually happened to them, and the restitution that truth finally made possible. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Eleanor Mercer, and with the hidden room that held far more than any treasure ever could. If this story reminded you of a time you found real worth in something the world had already given up on, we would love to hear about it in the comments below, and we would be grateful if you shared this story with someone who might need reminding that a forgotten place can still hold something worth uncovering. We'll leave you tonight with the question Eleanor herself might have carried with her long after the ranch house was finally her own. What is a time you found value in something others had already written off? Until next time, stay close.